Hey everybody, welcome to Wednesday. Feedback Friday is going to be really interesting based on the feedback to yesterday's video, which I like. I like every so often doing a video that is more about the feedback it inspires than my opinions on the thing. So I'm really looking forward to Feedback Friday this week. Some really cool stuff came in. Today, I want to talk about offensiveness. And I would say offense. You know, my late stepfather is probably rolling in his grave. It's not bloody offensiveness, it's bloody offense. And he's right, but people don't, when you say offense or offense, people are like, you talking about hockey? Okay, in Canada, right? But if you like this sort of topic, talking about offense or offensiveness, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK. Because I have been pondering this a lot because of various video game projects I'm working on. If you want to hear about those, become a patron. I don't talk about them publicly, but I do have permission from certain companies to talk about what I'm doing among my patrons, among the community. But there's a lot of conversations going on right now about where the line is. And of course, there isn't just one line. There's multiple lines and what those lines mean. And the question of offending deliberately or putting in content that you don't intend to be offensive, but you're where some people might take offense to it, all those things. And I've really discovered that the various lines are not just different depending on what country you're in, but also, you know, what state or province or prefecture or whatever within that country, and even like from district to district, from town to town, what's considered offensive varies widely. I mean, just for example, I've found just personally in my experience with the media. Actually, this isn't personal. This is stated fact that the Canadian media allows you to do more in terms of nudity than the American media does. We have community standards guidelines, and people can be topless on an Ontario street in a non-sexualized manner, meaning you're not like simulating a sex act. You're just, it's a breastfeeding thing. And so since you can do it on the street, you can do it on television. Not so in the US, except on premium cable, right? So, and granted, there are hours of the day you can do it and not, and all that stuff, but we are more liberal, I'll say, in, which is weird because it's the left that is freaking out about that stuff now. But we are less censorious of the human body than other places are. I don't know if it's because it's very cold in Canada many months of the year, so when we can let it all hang out, we do. But like, I don't know, just it just like right in our broadcast codes, it's totally different. And so when you go to make a game, you don't have an insider's knowledge of every country in the world. You can't possibly bring in a consultant from every place in the world and say, tell me, what will offend you, right? You just have to make your art and do your best and see what happens, which is why these outraged things, these demands for change simply based on somebody getting offended strike me as so strange. I think, and this is a professional opinion, that you have to provide more than just an I'm offended for a creator to take seriously a request for something changing. Now, as far as I know, The Last of Us 2 has still not patched that cross in that friggin' synagogue, and that's just a mistake. Like, that's just a mistake, and they haven't changed it because they've got their heads up their ass. And I mean, I think any other game company, quite frankly, I can't think of a game company yet who would make that mistake, have it pointed out on social media, and they don't fix it. Why? Just based on principle? Like, why can't there be a cross in a synagogue? Because it it isn't done precisely because it is considered offensive. And there is an example that if you wouldn't find something in a particular environment, like, for instance, also human artwork depicting human beings in a mosque, it's not done, right? That's not part of the religion. So if you saw that in a game, you'd go, that's BS. It's not a cultural practice. It's a mistake. It is a mistake because it would cause offense to that culture, but you're not complaining about the thing merely based on offensiveness. You're complaining about it because it's not realistic. See, that's the sort of thing. You need something other than just, I was offended. Now, mostly in games, and this is a thing that games have an issue with, that film and TV and books, it's less of an issue. It can still be an issue in those mediums, and I'll give you an example of one of those, but it's a bigger problem in games. If something feels dissonant, if it's so like out of left field, or it seems so out of place that it kicks you out of the experience, if it just kind of grinds your gears, that's a legitimate design complaint, right? Like, that's useful feedback. An example for me, and I know this is highly subjective, but the example for me was all the swearing in the show Picard. I otherwise like that show overall, even though it took way too long to get going. But I like that show overall, but the swearing, the amount of it didn't work for me. And every time they did it, I found myself going, and it doesn't bother me as much in Star Trek Discovery because I'm not looking at a character I watched before on TV. Like, there's no Next Generation character in Star Trek Discovery. So, okay, it's its own thing. You know, it predates the whole thing. Not by much, granted. I don't know if Starfleet cleaned up their act between, Captain Pike and Captain Kirk. But to see the exact same actor, Patrick Stewart there, and all of a sudden Picard's dropping F-bombs, it was weird for me, and I wouldn't have minded a few. I felt they were too liberal with it, and it sort of broke the Star Trek in the Star Trek series. Now, is this incredibly subjective? Could it work for someone else? Sure. But that's not me going, I'm just offended, change it. I'm saying stylistically, it had me hung up instead of having me just suspend my disbelief, right? With video games, that becomes, it's multiplied. That impact is multiplied because there's gameplay and there's narrative. And if you've got this, very elegant gameplay, and there's swear words and like potty jokes all over the place, it doesn't work stylistically, right? The reason that a game like God of War or when it's not janky, the combat in Nier Automata works is you have these larger than life kind of balletic superhero type of characters, balletic like ballet. You're just sort of taken, it's all surreal, and so like the swooshy like flying off the ground, it just works because the whole thing is a high wire act, right? It's all vaguely absurd. It requires you to suspend disbelief, so it all kind of goes together, right? As opposed to other experiences like, Gears of War, that's a deliberately grounded experience. The fact that you can't jump in Gears of War and the movement controls, and Gears 1, 2, and 3 anyway, are designed to make you feel like you're carrying around like really heavy armor. And so, you're not going to have that easy move. You can, you have the sprint, you've got the roadie runs, but you're not going to be jumping all over the place like a gazelle. It works. It works for the type of game. The narrative and the character designs match the game. Now, dialogue is similar, right? If you're creating a particular experience, you want dialogue, you want scenes that match, right? Some of the crazy stuff that happens in in the Saints Row games, practically anything goes in those games, though I found it interesting that instead of just going for like full frontal male nudity in one scene, they might have not been able to do it because of the ESRB, and they didn't want to get like an AO rating. But when Oleg comes out of that tank and it's like blurred TV style at his groin, I actually liked that touch. Just because it was sort of the way Saints Row is like, this is like if like movie like gangs, like movie crime families were in the real world, only not really, you know, like it's that surrealist, satirical way they do things. It made it funnier that it wasn't right in your face. And some people will say, oh, they whooshed out and everything like that, but they're not. That game doesn't try to be shocking. It tries to be funny in that, you know, you're 12 years old and you still giggle about boobs kind of way. The thing that's so great about Saints Row is they are adult games, but they're adult games from a big kid perspective, right? And if they sanitized too much, they would lose that tee-hee boobies thing, right? I mean, on TV, there are shows that deliberately use offensive language, like the show Deadwood. The swearing on Deadwood is not historically accurate because the stuff that was considered really bad swears in the Old West, nothing now, you know, blasphemy and stuff like that. So they used words that pack the same punch as a word would back then. Of course, then they have certain character names that were actually what those particular historical figures were called, but it involves the N-word. And so, you know, it's actually a good thing that they had all that hardcore swearing, because by the time you got to that character, I mean, there are probably some people who still go, whoa, when they say that word so casually. But if you actually Google that character, that is what he was called back then. And that's an example of a word that, I mean, it was always offensive, right? But it has become a you don't say that word, as opposed to other words that have softened in their perceived offense. And that's the problem with offense, right? It's a moving target. If you spend all your time just worried that you're going to offend someone, you're going to go crazy. Because what isn't offensive yesterday, what isn't offensive a year ago, is suddenly very offensive a year from now. I mean, I'm finally watching that show, The Newsroom, that Aaron Sorkin HBO show. And for the most part, like the actual stories they cover hold up very well. What doesn't hold up well at all is the way characters talk to each other. Especially in terms of workplace comments, which now would be considered sexual harassment. They do one storyline with an HR thing, but there are times I admit that I'm like, oh my God, right, this was made like 2012 to 2014 or something like that, 2014 to 2016. That's how much tastes have changed. That's how much workplace decorum in media has changed since, you know, in 5 years. That's how fast it can happen. And that's why I'm always very concerned when people go back and find, you know, 10-year-old tweets, 5-year-old tweets that somebody made and judge it by today's perspective. It has to be judged by what the tastes were at the time, as opposed to what the tastes are now. That's not the same as, you know, certain media companies, like the whole kerfuffle around Gone with the Wind, and them taking it down so that they can find a way to sort of contextualize that movie for modern sensibilities. But, you know, you can't go back and contextualize one of your tweets. right? Other than the date stamp on it, and it was 10 years ago, and sensibilities were very different. Now, certain things have not changed. There are certain things, we can agree are not just offensive. They are harmful. Somebody told me what we're supposed to call it now. Child sex abuse media, or media of child sex abuse, or something like that, instead of CP. Because pornography implies consent, which is not given in those cases. If that's true, then stuff like perhaps revenge porn should be renamed as well. But it's interesting that people are actually trying to change the name to be more accurate. I'm trying, even though I don't even remember the freaking term, because I see the point. It's actually more accurate. But very few people are going to argue that that sort of media should be allowed. We all agree it's child abuse. That's not okay. I remember when the movie Pet Sematary came out, and there was some concerns about the scenes that little boy was doing, and whether it was okay, whether it was psychologically okay for a kid that young to be around gore. It's not like in The Shining, right, where the kids don't have to see anything. Pet Sematary was pretty much there, right? There was a bit of a debate of that at the time. I know I'm old, okay? Some of the sketch comedies I loved, growing up, stuff like In Living Color, I'm sure that some of those sketches would be considered in really bad taste now. The thing is, they were kind of in bad taste back then, but in the 90s, you were allowed to do things in bad taste to make a point. And that's really what's changed more than anything, is you were allowed to do things that offended in comedy to show this is offensive. Now, people take everything so literally that they can't separate depicting something to mock it and depicting something to glorify it, right? People treat it as all the same. If it's in media, it's automatically approving of the practice. And that's not so, right? And I don't know if audiences are getting dumber, or how do I put this? Or people are just deliberately blurring the lines so that they don't have to make a better argument, because they can't make a better argument, right? Instead of getting into, does, say, nudity in this particular work say something about the character, advance the plot in some way, or do something other than look boobies, or whether it's just look boobies, and in some cases look boobies is fine, right? In others it's like, no, nice try, not here, right? And then we get into context, and context is subjective, and so on and so forth, and it's about the art people want to make. Again, if something has a lot of things that are just things, like a lot of the stuff in the 70s, it was just like random stuff, that was one thing. But if everything is like really super tightly crafted, and then there's something that seems really out of place, like certain scenes of nudity in the early seasons of Game of Thrones totally made sense to me. Other scenes I thought were gratuitous, because it was just like, okay, I can't tell if you're just being shameless right now or if you're wanting me to feel grossed out. I don't know. Others, I was like, no, this is totally like showing, how demeaned Daenerys is, or now she's sort of reclaiming herself, so they're juxtaposing the scenes. Certain ones I'll absolutely defend. Other scenes, not so much. Whereas, the nudity with the hosts in Westworld completely makes sense within the world. Altered Carbon was the same way. There was a lot of it, but it said something. Other things, not so much. And then now we land on the topic of fan service. And for people who don't know what fan service is stuff that's put in a work only to service the fans. It's only put in to make fans happy. It doesn't necessarily make sense. It isn't necessarily in great taste. They just throw it in. There you go, guys. Leave us alone, right? And whether this is offensive and horrible and it shows there's one sort of fan and there's another sort of fan and there's tiers of fans, or whether it's harmless fun. I come down on the harmless fun side of things, as long as it's done with a nudge and a wink. And as long as there's equal opportunity fan service, right? You're not just servicing one portion of your fan base and not ever the other portion of the fan base. Like, if you're like Fortnite and your fan base is basically 3 guys to every 1 woman playing the game, and you decided to do fan service, not saying they are, just those are the statistics I have in my mind right now. You should be doing 1 fan service for the ladies for every 3 you do for the guys, because that is the proportion of your audience you're servicing. If you do that, I don't have any problem with that. If you're only fan servicing one demographic over and over and over again, you are saying, no, these are the fans we want. These other fans, we don't really care if they, shit or go fishing. Sorry, that was a family colloquialism. I don't even know what it means. Like that's how you do fan service well, right? You look at the different requests and you try to cater to all tastes instead of just one taste. And you know what? Most people are perfectly fine with that. They'll put up with something they don't love, so they get a feature that they really, really, really love, right? And I think fighting games are a shining example of that. Like, people will, okay, I don't terribly love that character, so I'm not going to play as that character. I'm going to play my mains, and I'm going to, whenever they rebalance, I'm going to try a few other things. But if I really hate a character, I don't have to play as them. No problem. Like, for instance, in the early Soul Calibur games, I found Sung Shuao's voice just grating. Hey, just over and over again. I'm like, oh my God, shut up. Now, it made it fun to beat up, but couldn't stand it. I loved Ivy's voice. I loved Ivy's English voice actor. I think that's part of the affinity I had for the character. But was I like, take Sung Shuao out of the game? Like, no, I know she's an incredibly popular character, just because it annoyed me. Now, is it fair? Is it useful for me to say that the character annoyed me? Yeah, that's useful feedback. Maybe there's other people like me who found, and it's not the character overall, it's the voice, right? That that particular voice. None of the others, Talon going, wind, over and over again. I thought she was adorable. Just something about that one voice. It was just fingernails on a blackboard for me. And that's very subjective, right? If 10% of your fan base is saying that really annoyed me, maybe do something about it, like me with the music levels in my my scripted stuff. Patrons will get a boss fight update. But it wasn't that my music levels were wrong. It was that a large enough portion of the audience, of my viewers, were bothered by it for me to turn it down. Because you know what? The people that were fine with it higher, it's no skin off their nose for the music levels to be lower. But for the people who found it too high, they found it distracting. So that's an example of listening to feedback where it's a win-win, right? Or it's a win neutral. But when you get into these fan service wars where you know that making one portion of your fan base really, really happy risks offending another portion of the fan base that doesn't like it at all. That's a really challenging problem for developers because on the one hand, enthusiasm, audience enthusiasm or consumer enthusiasm is a very important metric, especially when you're trying to sell DLC and you're trying to get those advocates for your property. You know, while you're advertising, you need these people who just love your game to death to go out there and tell people how much they love your game. What you don't want is a fan base so rabid that they go just nasty on anybody with a difference of opinion that, you know, makes people go, no, they are psychotic. I want nothing to do with your property, your game, because you know what? Anything I say about it, if it's not the majority opinion, I'm going to get roasted and I can't be bothered. I just rather not deal at all. It's a very fine line, right? Now, okay, what you encourage has something to do with it, but I mean, some fandoms just make no sense. Why is Steven Universe fandom so toxic? I have no idea. It seems totally separate from the property itself, right? So sometimes things just get weird. I don't get why Rick and Morty fans have a higher than average tendency to be massive assholes either. I see that more in the cartoon, but I don't really think that that the cartoon advocates being a jerk just because some of the characters are. It's a very strange phenomenon. And sometimes the developers do things to egg that on. A lot of the times they don't, right? And so there's only so much control a developer has over that. However, if they do... See, I think development should go forward as everybody gets something, as opposed to we're going to take away all the potentially offensive content so we offend no one. And that's what I find so silly about properties like Mortal Kombat, right? Like, okay, they dialed back the super duper violence for a while, but that came back. But the sexy ladies didn't. Shirtless guys, still plenty of shirtless guys in Mortal Kombat, but the sexy ladies didn't come back. Why? Like, no matter what that game franchise does, somebody's going to complain about the brutal, over-the-top, ridiculous violence. So why not have the sexy guys? Why not have the sexy ladies? Have something for everybody, because you don't want young teens playing that game anyway. My God, it's way too brutal. Those are the ones I don't get, you know? Other game franchises that, like, going back to Fortnite, their audience is really young. Like, their player base is really, really young. I understand keeping the content cleaner in that regard. That makes complete sense to me. But I mean, you know, the historically accurate violence and nudity in God of War was perfect for that game, because that game franchise has mature themes, not just in the sex and violence, but also in the emotional, the life experience required for you to sort of connect with what's going on with that game. You need a certain amount of maturity to follow what's happening in that story, because some of it is quite subtle. A lot of critics didn't get it until Dad of War, because of course those people who were crapping all over the first game, well, they're 10 to 12 years older now, right? Maybe they have kids now. Now all of a sudden they're right in the zone. And that's why I don't think games should be judged based on still images. I think it's totally fair to comment on the marketing and what you see from the marketing and what gives you concerns and this, that, and the next thing. But to just judge a game outright, that way you really can't, right? You have to see the finished product. You have to see things in context. But I don't think that this current climate of offend no one is working for anyone, because you're always going to offend someone, right? And it's weird, right? Even though LGBTQ plus content still offends some people, people ignore those complaints, right? Because those are bad. But stuff that appeals to heterosexual gamers, when those heterosexual gamers happen to be men, is seen as bad. Like, it's the exact opposite response. And that makes no sense to me. Because just because you put in some content that appeals to heterosexual guys doesn't mean that has to be the only type of content you put in your game. Other characters and storylines can appeal to, not heterosexual guys, or heterosexual women, or not heterosexual women, or trans people, or pansexual people who want some blinking, gender non-conforming romance options, because that would be a neat thing to explore in a game. Just saying. And you don't have to choose only one and go whole hog there. Gaming is about choice. Put a little bit into it. I don't know anybody who would refuse to buy a game just because there was one thing in it that they didn't like. I mean, look at all the people who couldn't stand Sarah in Dragon Age Inquisition. They still bought the game, right? They complained to high hell about Sarah, but they bought the game. And they probably liked other parts of the game because other people love Sarah. I mean, my do not like in Dragon Age Inquisition was very strange. But, I played around the stuff I didn't like so I could play with the stuff I did like. Unfortunately, in that game, the stuff I didn't like outweighed the stuff I did like. And that's when you get into the, bigger issues of, is your game overall successful or not artistically? But that's a topic for another time. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this as I start to cough again. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Thanks for watching.